All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our virtual Young Israel of West Hartford. It's a pleasure to welcome everyone who's joining us from near and far with all different languages and accents. We're really honored to have Rabbi Silberhaft with us this morning. I want to start off by thanking Dr. Ronit Kaufman, our program chair, for putting this together and all of her wonderful and tireless work for our community. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much, Ronit. It's so nice to see so many people's faces. If I could ask you, we'll be doing some Q&A at the end, but if you could please just keep your microphones muted for the time being so that we don't interrupt the presentation. We'd love to see your faces, so you could be on screen. We'd love to see you. With that, it's my pleasure to welcome and introduce Rabbi Moshe Silberhaft, widely known as the Traveling Rabbi, the spiritual leader and national director of the Small Jewish Communities Association and the African Jewish Congress. The Small Jewish Community Association was founded in 2009 to 2019 to carry on the work of the country communities Department of South Africa Jewish Board of Deputies. There have been many thriving Jewish communities in small towns in South Africa and other African countries, which have disappeared, and unfortunately their synagogues have closed. And as people move to main cities or migrated, Rabbi Silberhaft is one of the few who continues to tend to those Jewish communities. The Traveling Rabbi has many facets: a spiritual leader, a one-man Chevrah Kadisha, caring for graves of the forgotten and tracing their descendants, as well as a romantic rabbi who performs wedding ceremonies on various different beaches at sunrise, sunset. He's also a caterer, a counselor, a teacher, and above all, a wonderful friend. He's seventh in the line of community rabbis. We are so honored to welcome him this morning and his following who are joining us. Without further ado, Rabbi Silberhaft, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Brenda, for your introduction, and to Dr. Ronit for hounding me eventually to pin me down to make today happen. Thank you very much. What are you guys seeing there? Are you seeing the image?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, because I'm not very good with these things. Okay, all right. So first of all, to everybody in South Africa, it's good afternoon. In the UK, it's good afternoon, and in the United States, it's good morning. How long have we got? An hour, is that right?
As long as you want.
As long as I want, okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a brief introduction of South African Jewish history, and then I'll give you some specific information about the history of our communities that we dealt with over the years. I'm just going to try and find, sorry, I should be more au fait with these things, but I will. Right, okay, what does it say? Okay, can you all see this guy standing next to his chair?
Nope.
No, okay, let's share image, screen. There, you got it?
Yep.
Right, okay, so the history of South African Jewry goes back to 1820, when the first Jews arrived in South Africa. The first recorded Jews. There were Jews before in the 1657 with Vasco da Gama, but they had to convert to Christianity to be allowed on his ship, so they weren't counted as Jews at the time. But the first Jews to arrive were Benjamin Norden with 17 others. They arrived at Algoa Bay. There was no Port Elizabeth in those days, for those of you that know Port Elizabeth. So they went up to Grahamstown. And in 1821, he moved with some of his members to Cape Town, where they held the first Yom Kippur service in Cape Town. And there they established the Cape Town Hebrew congregation. And that was the first recorded congregation in South Africa. So in actual fact, it goes back to 1821, and now we're in 2022. So the South African Jewish community is 201 years old. And you will all admit that everybody knows about the warm, dedicated Zionistic Jewish community of South Africa and the wonderful, positive contributions they make wherever they go. Now, after Norden's arrival, there were two brothers, the Mosenthal brothers. They were from Germany, and they arrived in the 1830s. And they established a huge network of trading centers in and around the area of Graafrenet, which is part of the Eastern Cape. And they became massive sheep traders as well, to the extent that they had their own currency at one point. They were such big traders. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, you can hear me. Okay. Also, there were early pioneers with Sammy Marks, who arrived in 1860. And thereafter, in 1880, there was a large wave of South African Jews that came to South Africa. David Sachs, who's a renowned South African historian, records the following. He says that the existing Jewish community found the Litvaks barbaric and uncouth, while the Litvaks basically thought that the others were Goyim. There was this cultural difference between the Germans, the British, and the Litvaks. But he continues, he says, but despite this, they did fuse together and create a very powerful and prominent and dedicated South African Jewish community. Some places, as we know, Kimberley and Oudtshoorn, which were large centers, had two kinds of communities. They had the local community, and then they had the English shul, where the upper class Germans and the English went to the Litvaks, the Lithuanians, and the Polish weren't of the right caliber for them to worship with. I always like to try and begin by trying to explain to people, try and imagine when they arrived to South Africa. They arrived to South Africa late 1800s, early 1900s. We know they came from Eastern Europe, from Germany, from England, some of them. And just try and picture for a minute, they arrive at the docks of Cape Town or Durban, where the ships docked, and the climate they were not used to, the language they were not used to, and please don't get upset what I'm going to say, but they had never seen black people before, and there was a sea of black people. And try and understand, what is my point here? My point here is to make people understand the power and dedication that a Jew has to survive. And here you had a situation where they arrived from Eastern Europe. They had snow, as you just said, you had snow today. That's America. They had snow, they had cold weather. Here they arrived, there was heat. They didn't have the language. Some of them had very little money. But most cases, as we know, it was either the pull or the push factor. They were either pushed out because of pogroms and anti-Semitism, or they were pulled by the discovery of business, of diamonds, of gold, etc. So that's a very important thing we need to understand. Today it's very different. You arrive and you go into an air-conditioned apartment, etc., etc. Here they arrived. They came in their three-piece suits, as you all remember, with the bowler hats, etc., into this wild African country. How did they survive? Many of them arrived with a couple of pounds, whatever they had in those days, in their pockets, and they became smos. They became peddlers. What did they do? They went to a main center, and they went to a Jewish dealer, distributor, and they said, listen, give us stuff and we'll peddle through the towns and we'll sell your goods. And they became known as smos, the Jewish peddlers. And they became so prominent and so powerful that many of the farmers had something called a smos kamer, which means a smos room. They knew that the Jew wouldn't eat with them. The Jew wouldn't worship with them. The Jew did his own thing. So they had a room in the side of their farm where the peddler used to arrive. And there they had a pot for him to boil his potatoes or his eggs, etc., and daven and stay on his own. They became a massive force. Not only did they do business for themselves, when they eventually came to a town and they saw an opportunity where they could establish themselves, they established themselves. Many of them sent for their wives and children, those that weren't traveling with their family. And that's how communities established. they also, not only did they come and sell goods, etc., and they were selling from, there's a whole book about the Jewish Samosa, that they were selling from cabbages to underwear to bullets to whatever you wanted, you could imagine, they were selling it. And they also spread the news. They'd go from one town to the next, and they tell the Jewish community, oh, you know, down the road in the town community, and don't forget, there weren't roads. They had to go through the bush, and there are hundreds of Jewish Samosa that actually died while they were peddling, while they were traveling. At night, they'd pull over on the side of a sand road, wherever, and sleep under near the horse, or sleep under the carriage. And they would be attacked by snakes or wild animals, and they would die there. So that we have thousands of unmarked graves in Jewish cemeteries, not all of Samosa, but many of them are Samosa that were traveling, and they had no form of identification. There was no emails and WhatsApp in those days, so the local community just buried them. To dedicate to these incredible personalities, there was a Mr. Frank Horwitz in Graaff-Reinet, in the town of Graaff-Reinet. That's Frank and myself. Many years ago, I was a lot younger, as you can see. Graaff-Reinet is the third oldest Jewish, houses the third oldest Jewish cemetery in South Africa. So Jews first arrived in Algoa Bay, then to Grahamstown. From there, they went to Cape Town, and from there, and then the Mosenthals, etc., moved up to Graaff-Reinet. So Graaff-Reinet goes back to the early 1850s. And in 1980, Frank Horwitz was the mayor of the town. He was the last Jew there with his wife. And he decided that he wants to erect a monument to the Samosa. And this is the monument. I don't know, can you all see it? Ronit?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So there you see it's got the English. This monument is erected in honor of the Jewish peddlers, in honor of the pioneer Jewish peddlers known as Samosa, who traded in outlying and remote country districts. They supplied their customers with many of the necessities of life. In the course of their trading, they made contributions to the economic development of the country. And then you've got Le Zikaron in the middle, and then the translation in Afrikaans on the other side. And it's become a great tourist attraction for people going through the town. Now, a Jewish guy decided that he's going to come and live in Graaff-Reinet. He moved there, and he established a shop called Die Samosa. Brian Hugh, he's Jewish, and he runs a shop called Die Samosa. And he's an incredible personality and a wonderful, and everybody loves to stop off at him and have a chat. That is the third oldest Jewish cemetery in South Africa, in Graaff-Reinet. These are the foundation stones of the shul. Now, if you look carefully, see that building behind the shul, behind the cemetery? That was the shul. It's the only place that I've ever visited where the shul and the cemetery are basically on the similar or close by. But these are the foundation stones of the shul, which didn't have a very long lifespan. As you see, it was built in already 1954, and by 1980s, it was gone. There was a very, very prominent prominent Afrikaans businessman in South Africa by the name of Johann Rupert. Anton Rupert. Johann is his son. And they came from Graaff-Reinet, and he was very excited to hear that the Jewish community were also involved in upgrading the town where his family came from. And he offered to fund the project, which he did. As you see here, a booklet on the Jewish community of Graaff-Reinet, a brief history, which is available at the information center as you come into town. So it's a wonderful, there again, you see that the contribution of Jews going back to 1850, 1860 is still remembered today. I want to just read here, when Frank passed away, Frank Horwitz, the picture I showed you just now, a local Gentile in the town in 1999 said the following. He said, and I quote, he said, Graaff-Reinet in particular, the whole of South Africa for that matter, owes the Jewish nation a great debt. They have contributed to our religion, economy, culture, art, and history. I loved Frank for his Jewishness. He loved Jewish heritage and was intensely proud of it. It was his Jewishness that made him put almost a quarter of a century into the affairs of the town, all of them unpaid. It was his Jewishness that made him recall with no small measure of pride the contribution of the Jewish Samosa of South Africa, especially in the frontier areas of the Karoo. It was his Jewishness that gave him great compassion for the welfare of his fellow men. And this Gentile concluded by saying, "We are here today to honor the memories of a man, a Jew, who served his God here in the Karoo, who gave of himself willingly that others may have the better life we all search for because of his Jewishness." And that, my dear friends, says so much about so many of the Jewish people that lived in the country communities. And at its peak, there were over 40,000 Jews in the country communities. And many of them did make huge contributions to the local community, not only to the local Jewish community, but to the local community on a whole. And that is one of the great attributes and legacies of the Jews, that they always gave in a larger proportion to their size, etc. And in fact, there's they say when the Jews leave a town in South Africa, you know, it's time to leave, the town is dead. Because when a Jew leaves, it means, first of all, that he's feeling vulnerable. And second of all, that there's no more opportunities. Now, why did Jews leave the country communities, and where did they go? So as I said to you, at its peak, there were 40,000 Jews in the small towns. Today, there are about 1,300. We need to take into consideration that South African Jewry has dropped by more than 70% in its general total numbers. So Jews came to the small towns and they started with farming, with trading stores, etc. And they were mainly general dealers, algemene handelaars. For those that are listening that understand Afrikaans, it means general dealer stores. They used to sell everything from, as I said, cabbages to horse saddles to bullets to dresses, whatever you wanted, you could buy from the Jewish community, the Jewish owned shop. And what's very interesting is many of the towns and the farmers in particular, when they had drought and they couldn't pay for what they wanted to buy, they used to go to the Jewish shops. And they used to have credit for years in anticipation, hopefully, that when the Almighty blessed them with rain again, they would get paid for the debt. So the Jews established themselves in these small towns. In many of the towns, Jews contributed as a community to establish churches and vice versa. In many of the towns, the local churches contributed to the establishment and the building of a small synagogue in the various towns. Don't forget that the Afrikaans people believe that the Jewish people are the chosen nation, God's chosen nation, and therefore it's in their interest and their belief to respect the Jew. We won't talk at this stage about the huge amount of anti-Semitism that took place during the Second World War and before by various Afrikaans groups, but in general, I'm just talking about in general. As I said before, the attractions to South Africa was the diamonds in Kimberley, the gold in Transvaal, chain stores. And why did people move out of the small communities eventually is because the chain stores arrived in the towns. And now all of a sudden the Jewish shops became redundant. Second, they didn't want their kids to stay in the towns and be traders like them. They wanted them to go to the bigger centers, Johannesburg, Cape Town, Pretoria, etc., and to study, to become a doctor, to become an accountant, become a lawyer. And when they sent their kids off, we used to have huge hostels at the Jewish schools here, where Jewish children used to come from age 9, 10, all the way through to the end of school. And so the parents moved to Johannesburg to be with their kids. So that's the reason for the decline of the small communities. Now, what's interesting is that since 1950, 1960, and then 1970 with the Soweto riots and the change to the end of apartheid, etc., People have been leaving the bigger centers all the time, but the country communities have been feeding in to the large community centers in Johannesburg and Cape Town. So whenever I give public talks and I begin by saying, who here comes from a small community? Historically, 40–50% of the people put their hands up and say, I came or my parents came, etc. So West Johannesburg and Cape Town never really felt the impact of immigration. But now, because the country communities are diminishing so rapidly in numbers, and their numbers are so low, so the bigger centers are now feeling the pinch and the immigration. There are two important things I'd like to say today, which I want you to keep in mind, which apply to Jews all over the world and to every single Jew. And Rabbi, don't worry, I'm not lecturing, I'm not giving a drosha to your congregants. It's just two thoughts I'd like to share with you, and then I'll continue. The one is that we Jews don't live in the past. We live through our past. I'll say it again. We Jews don't live in the past. We live through our past. We carry our tradition. We carry our heritage. We carry everything that came before us, the story of our parents, of our grandparents, etc. We carry it with us, and we live through that. We don't start afresh. We continue to grow, but with the history that our ancestors sowed. And also, we don't predict the future. Jews can't predict the future. We create our future. And it's very important when you're living in isolated small communities to understand, and with all the anti-Semitism that's going on, etc., and everything that's happening in the world, to that our behavior and how we conduct ourselves, that is what creates our future. We can't sit back and say, well, the world, etc., etc. We have to create our future. So in Prince Alfred Hamlet, there was a gentleman by the name of Jos Khan, who still lives there today. He's the last Jew in the town. And he says that today, the average Gentile has never interacted with a Jew, has never met a Jew. Now I don't know in America, but people, when you meet people in the bigger centers and you talk to them and you say, what is a Jew? People just talk on the news, they see about Jew, but what is, and the reality is that in South Africa, most people in the towns have never interacted or seen a Jew. And I always tell the story that there was a town called Victoria West, where we needed to exhume 2 Jewish bodies that the municipality rezoned this area for the cemetery, and we had to exhume the 2 bodies, and a member of the health department had to be present to observe the exhumation. And it was a young Afrikaans lady, and she saw my kippah, and at the end of everything we're doing, she said to me, tell me, what's your story? Like, who are you? What are you? What do you do? And I told her, I'm a rabbi. And she said, are you a Jew? So I said, yes. She said, I've never seen a Jew. I've heard on the radio, on the TV about Israel and fighting, but I've never, can I touch you? She said, I've never interacted with a Jew. She was in absolute awe. And we in South Africa and people around the world have to realize the importance of what it means that, we take so much for granted. And in life in general, when we judge situations, etc., we often have to think about how the other person or why they react the way they do. What is their background? What is their knowledge? What is the lack of the issue that's being discussed? Jews in the small towns, as I said earlier, contributed immensely to the local communities, to the growth of the town, to the local schools, for the local black children, Afrikaans children, etc. And in Swellendam, a town called Swellendam, some of you may know where it is, there's a man by the name of David Schlapperbursky, and he is known as, by the local colored and black community, as Moses, because he's Jewish, and he gives to the community. Unfortunately, the local Afrikaans community call him an exploiter because he's Jewish, so they say he's come to the town to exploit. So it's a difficult one. It's a very difficult situation, but in South Africa, because we are so small in numbers, we have to be super careful how we interact with people and on what levels. And I must tell you that in my 29 years of traveling on the road, I've only had 2 experiences of anti-Semitism, and both were out of sheer ignorance. There was nothing, once I explained to them what the situation was, they were totally apologetic, and it was sheer ignorance. We experiencing in South Africa at the moment a huge amount of intermarriage, or people marrying out of the faith, and nevertheless, it's my policy in my role as the traveling rabbi is not to judge people, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu will one day deal with it. I mean, we don't know why people do what, etc. But the fact is that it's not for us to judge and alienate people. And to show the incredible sensitivity of this, in a town called Da'ar, there was a man by the name of Radansky, and he had a furniture shop. Now, he wished to be cremated. His wife wasn't Jewish. He did nothing Jewish. But the one window of his shop was painted over white. And I said to him, I know the furniture business, and if you're in the furniture business, you need to have lots of exposure, windows, open big windows, etc. How can you have a whole side of a window of a shop painted over? And he said, come, I want to show you. And he took me by the hand, and we went outside the shop and went around the corner. And across the road was the shul, which he had his bar mitzvah in. And it was now a church. And he said to me, Rabbi, I cannot look at the building where I had my bar mitzvah, that it's a church today. Yet he was married out of the faith. His children weren't Jewish, and he wanted to be cremated, and he was cremated, unfortunately. But yet that sensitivity. So that's what I'm saying. From my perspective, Rabbi, each rabbi has their own, but from my perspective, it's so important to show that sensitivity to every single Jew and to every single human being, and not to judge them for these kind of behaviors, because we don't know why they do it and what the reasoning is, etc. So that's just a story. In 2012, we wrote a book called The Travelling Rabbi, My African Tribe. And there's the image on the screen. It was a bestseller for 3 years. And interestingly enough, thousands of non-Jews and Christian groups bought it because they found and they were so attracted to the story that here's an individual going around from town to town, visiting isolated Jewish people. We don't collect money from anybody. It's purely just to keep people connected. And the late Chief Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs wrote the preface for it, which I was very honored. And also there's a lady by the name of Mandy Wiener, who's a journalist in South Africa, a top journalist. She also wrote the foreword to the book. Sorry, the foreword was by Rabbi Sachs. She wrote the preface. And I know her from her bat mitzvah, from a wedding, from the birth of her first child. My association with her family goes back over 35 years. Very, very good, proud Jews. And it was a great, as I say, it was a great publication, and people still asking for it. We began a second book, but unfortunately the lady that wrote it passed away. So one of our main jobs today is cemetery maintenance. Here you see vandalism of the Hermelo Jewish Cemetery. 99% of graves that are vandalized in South Africa are not from anti-Semitism. It's purely vagrants that are looking for a thrill, and they go and they kick over stones, and they in the town called Lichtenberg, there were 4 16-year-old high school kids that were high on a Saturday night, and they went and they pushed over 68 tombstones. And when we asked them, why did you do it? They said the thrill of that bang as the stone fell and smashed was an incredible thrill, especially when they were so high on drugs. So what we do now around South Africa to prevent damage is we lay the headstones flat, as you can see here in the pictures. This is the Hermelo Cemetery. Those were before and after pictures. We look after over 30,000 graves in 220 Jewish cemeteries around the country. 99.9% of these graves have been, I wouldn't like to use abandoned, but have been, their family members have moved on and not left any plan for maintenance of the family graves. And I always say to people, and I'm not popular for it, but I always say that I hope their children won't one day abandon their graves like they've abandoned their family graves in the small towns. Our cemetery maintenance costs us over 2 million rand a year, and we have to fundraise for it. But as I said, 99% of the people buried in these graves, their families have left South Africa and have made no provisions for the maintenance of their graves. This is Hermelo. If anybody's watching, it's Hermelo. So that's the non-Jewish cemetery down there. That building here is the old Ohel, the old chapel. That's what's left of it. But this is the cemetery. These here with the concrete slabs had no, these were unmarked graves. We managed to find the register and we had stones made and erected on each grave. This is warm bars, now known as Bella Bella. That's what it looked like before. You can see this, this is the black cemetery. You can see it's just a massive sea of graves. And that's what it looks like today. We laid all the headstones flat and put a short wall around it. The wall is not for protection at all. It's just to demarcate. What we found as well in these areas is that cattle and animals were walking through the cemeteries, and cattle with their big bodies were bumping stones and pushing them over. But even once the stones were flat, they were messing. So we put walls around our cemeteries. This is Parais, vandalized Jewish graves. This is Allowal North. How magnificent is that? That is the Orange River flowing. That's the border of the Eastern Cape. That's obviously an aerial picture from our drone. And there you see all the headstones have been laid flat. And it's in immaculate. We make sure that all our cemeteries are well looked after. This is Dordrecht for the South Africans. Will know what I'm talking about, also Eastern Cape. We try and preserve the foundation stones, whatever memory comes out of the cemetery, out of the shuls in the local cemeteries. So this is the Ohel in Kroonstad that was badly vandalized, as you can see. So we managed to retain this section of the wall here. And we set all the foundation stones from the shul in this wall, and we maintained it as a site for tourists to come and read the history of the community, and we keep it clean and painted, well painted, etc. So every bit of history is essential to us. I'm going to skip now to a couple of our African countries because time is moving on, and I'd like to have some questions. I'll just touch on two African countries. The one is Mauritius, one of Indian Island Ocean. Most people don't know that in 1939, a ship of 1,650 Jews were deported from British Palestine by the British. They left Eastern Europe. The ships arrived in Atlit. And they were there for 2 weeks, and the British declared them illegals. And they were deported. At that stage, the war was raging already. They couldn't go back to Eastern Europe. Mauritius was under the British Empire. And they had this prison, which you're looking at now, called the Boba Son Prison. And the men, Jewish men, were put in this prison for 4.5 years. You see their central prison. It's built in 1888. That's the Israeli ambassador. That's me also a long time ago, but that's the Israeli ambassador. We had the privilege of him accompanying us. During their time on the island, 127 of them died and were buried in Mauritius on the island. South Africa, being the closest Jewish community to these detainees, as they were known, they weren't prisoners, they were detainees, were made responsible for looking after them. And South Africa used to send every few days stuff to Mauritius, from medical equipment to religious stuff to reading material, just to keep these detainees connected and well looked after while they were on the island. And you can see that 1940 was the first burial and 1945 was the last burial. And they erected this wooden sign, "Blessed be the true judge," before they left. And that's what the cemetery looked like when they left in 1945. There you can see it's, so these stones are made from volcanic rock, and they inscribed them with Hebrew and English, as you can see. But then there was a storm and these stones were pushed over. The local Mauritians went in and tried to, they made new stones, but they tried to copy the Hebrew, and most of them, they couldn't obviously copy it. So we've had over time new stones erected at the base of each stone with the accurate information. We've added the Hebrew date of, the English date of death, the Hebrew date of death, where they were born and from where they were deported. So it's become a huge site of interest historically for Jewish history. As I said, most people don't know about this part of the Holocaust where Jews were deported from British Palestine by the British. And I'll tell you quickly a story that I was invited to Buckingham Palace to meet the Queen. And for those of you that aren't familiar, there's a lot of protocol that goes in to before you actually meet her, and they tell you how to address her and how to speak to her and what you can say, what you can't say. And there are a few things you don't say. You obviously say Your Royal Highness. If you remember, if you mention any of, if you refer to any of her family members, you have to refer them by their title. And there's a whole list of stuff. Anyway, and I was there, and I was just beginning to work on this project, and I was quite passionate about the idea and angry that her father, who was the king at the time, under his rule, these people were deported from British Palestine. First of all, over 220 of them died because they objected to leaving Palestine, and they blew up the ship, and they all drowned in Atlit. And then on the island, 127 of them died. So anyway, it came my time to meet her. She walked over to me. I was next in line, and I had a tag on my lapel, and she said, "You're such a young man doing such a big job, etc., etc." And we're chatting this and that. And she said, "What are you working on lately? What's your latest project?" So I began to tell her the whole story of Mauritius. And then I said, "Sadly, your father," I was going to say your father had, under his rule, these people were deported. She just walked off because I broke protocol. So, Rabbi, if you ever get to meet the Queen, make sure you taught all the protocol and you observe all the protocol before you upset her. So that was then I felt that it was important to record the history, this history. And this building you're seeing here is a 190-year-old chapel next to the Jewish cemetery. And it took us 10 years for the municipality to give us permission to have it and convert it into a museum. So that's what it looked like before. And that's what it looks like now. It's a Jewish museum on the island. We opened it in 2014. It's called the Boba Son Jewish Detainees Memorial and Information Center. It was opened, as you see, in November 2014. And it's very basic. It's got panels going all the way around the walls with the history in chronological order. And then these panels in the middle have features, as well as we upgrade them every so often with various things. But what's most important today, besides tourists come there, every high school student, I don't know what you call high school in America, but any kid over age 13 to 17 or 18 has to visit this museum as part of their syllabus and learn about the history of the Jews that were on the island as detainees for 4.5 years. So all of a sudden, you've got this massive interest of a part of Jewish history that most people never knew about, not only from Jewish people, but the schools as well. We also built a community center, and in here there's one shul. There's also another shul in the north. As the rabbi introduced me, a romantic rabbi, I used to do many weddings on the beach in Mauritius. So if anybody wants to get married, this is the destination to choose. Okay, then I'll move to Zambia. Zambia Jewry goes back also to the late 1800s, early 1900s. And here we had a gentleman, David Sussman, who founded Woolworths. The chain store Woolworths funded a museum called the Gateway Jewish Museum in Livingston. This is where the Victoria Falls are, because the first Jews, when they arrived in Zambia, which was called in those days Northern Rhodesia, they first established themselves in Livingston, and then they moved up to Lusaka and even north to the Copperbelt, etc. So this is the sign at the entrance. How it works is it's got panels going back as the first Jews arrived. It's very simple because there's very little power. There are power problems there, and there is electricity problems. It's Africa, so we keep it as user-friendly and low maintenance as possible. Here as well, we get about 6,000 visitors a month. It's both the school kids from the area as well as tourists, because the Victoria Falls is very popular for international tourists. And this too is a part of history that most people never knew about. In the middle, there's a display cabinet here, as you see, with the Ner Tamid from one of the shuls, a shofar, candlesticks, a yad, etc., talit. It's to create Jewish interest in an area where there aren't any Jews left living in the area. This is the old Sefer Torah from Kitwe on the Copperbelt, which is on display for people to understand what I said, but it's sealed so nobody can touch it, etc. As I said to you, we have, because the local black kids come from the high school, they come to visit and learn. We have one interactive audio-visual presentation. The rest is all just still images. And here they are watching the presentation, and very, very well received. And they find it very interesting. In fact, there's a book that we're publishing now with all the history of the communities in the country, which we're going to do it in a paperback form for kids to take home and learn about, first of all, not only the Jewish contribution to Zambia, Northern Rhodesia, but the Jewish way of thinking and the importance of working with others, uplifting others, working for other people. Unfortunately, often the mentality is just, what can I get out of the situation? And nothing more than that. So I think we'll stop at that for now, and then let's go to any questions or comments, and then I'll carry on with a few other comments after that. Dr. Ronit, you there?
I'm here. Does anybody feel free to chime in with questions? That was great. Thank you so much.
Right. Anybody questions, anything of interest?
Judy, did you want to ask a question? Okay, you unmuted yourself.
Okay, hold on.
Rabbi, if you want something, my middle name is Norden, George Norden Abrams. Benjamin Norden, his brother, Joshua Davis.
Joshua Davis.
All would be brothers to my great-grandfather, who was also Abraham Norden. So, and I was, my parents were married in Garden Shul. I was married in the Garden Shul. I was bar mitzvahed in the Garden Shul. So there's a long relationship with that. And what you have said certainly resonated with me about the Smos. My grandfather arrived as a Smos. He went to Mosenthal's in Port Elizabeth. They gave him goods. He didn't pay for them. He went out in the country, sold the goods, came back and paid and got more goods. So it resonates even till today.
Amazing. So you know all about it. Absolutely. Absolutely. So Joshua Davis Norden is buried. He was the first Jewish burial in South Africa, was in Grahamstown, and that was Joshua Davis Norden. He was killed in a battle. You know the story.
Well, there's a plaque on the back wall of the Grahamstown Cathedral which I'm
Correct.
surprised that the ANC hasn't yet removed, because it refers to the fact that he was killed while defending against the inroads of a barbarous savage.
They've covered that over, by the way. Those words, barbarous savage, they've covered it over.
Okay.
Don't worry. Yeah. I'll just show you something of interest. You all see this tombstone?
Nope.
Can you see it?
Nope.
Okay, now.
Nope. There we go.
Right. In 1939, a German gentleman by the name of Walter Geller passed away in a town called Swakopmund in Namibia. And his wife wasn't Jewish. They buried him. And then she knew she had to put something Jewish, something Hebrew on his tombstone. So she couldn't find anything except apparently a bottle of kosher wine or matzah or something. So if you look here carefully, it says kosher lepesach. You see that? Kosher lepesach. So only Hebrew she could find. So she gave it to the stonemason and he put it on obviously upside down and backwards. But over time, we've had it removed because out of respect to him. People were beginning to come and visit the grave and just create a full mockery of it. But there, can you all see kosher lepesach? So if you hear the story, it's a true story.
Rabbi, this is O speaking. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I'm trying to find how to get back to see everybody.
Anyway, we took a tour of South Africa and Zimbabwe and Botswana right before COVID struck, almost exactly 2 years ago.
Okay.
And tour guide was a man named Rabbi Menachem Fogel. Do you know him?
Yeah, sure, of course.
Yeah.
Sure.
So he was really great, and he took us to some of these communities. And there was one that was, had maybe 6 Jews left in it. I can't remember the name of it, but it had a beautiful synagogue, and the leader of the community came and gave us a talk. But it was a community that was built on ostrich, of ostrich farmers. So
the town is called Oudtshoorn.
Yeah, exactly. That was it.
And interesting, Oudtshoorn in 1907, when it was the peak of the ostrich feather trade, had more Jews than Cape Town did. It was such a strong community.
Wow. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So did you enjoy South Africa, your visit?
Yes, very much, of course.
And it's a wonderfully warm community as well. Anybody else been to South Africa, visited any South African towns of interest?
There's somebody raising their hand. Relly.
Okay, so let them.
Okay, let me unmute myself. Hi, Rabbi. Thank you very much for your talk. Very interesting, fascinating. I wonder, since you reach out to various small communities in Africa, have you been doing any work at all or reached out to the Lemba around the Limpopo or the Lemba in Zimbabwe? They have a synagogue now in Harare. Do you have any relationship with them?
Sure. So in Zimbabwe, we work very closely. Modrek is their rabbi, and we work very closely with him, and we offer them any assistance that they require. Quite interesting that you have two scenarios with the Lemba and the Abu Yudaya in Uganda, for example, is they do wish to have and receive assistance from the local Jewish communities, but it's minimal because they actually want to do their own thing. They don't want us to come along and tell them this is how you do it, this is how it should be done, etc. But Modrek, we assisted them with building their Knesset. They've got a yeshiva there now. And yeah, absolutely, very strong, very, very strong. I think it's very important that if you explain to them where they fit in the situation, and there's a common understanding, everybody works very well together. In South Africa, I find, from my perspective, is many people that are married, particularly the men that are married to non-Jewish wives, instead of ostracizing them, explain to them what the situation is. And you know, obviously, if they want to convert, yes, sure. But if not, and I can tell you that in most of my communities, my Chevrah Kadishas today are these young Jewish guys with Afrikaans wives. And it's the wives that are sending the husbands. The rabbi's coming to town, go and help him. Go and meet him. We want him, you know, go and do your thing. So our philosophy is to work and embrace everybody, but just, you're not going to please everybody, but most people you do please if you explain to them respectfully where they fit in and what the issues are. And in many, as I said, in many of our communities, when we need a minyan, etc., it's the non-Jewish wives that are sending their husbands, go, the rabbi's here, or there's a funeral, go help him, you know, because it's all the youngsters. So, yeah.
I met Modric 15 years ago in Harare when he was just starting to learn Hebrew. He was teaching himself. And I've got a long association with the Lemba in Zimbabwe, not in South Africa, but in Zimbabwe.
Fantastic. They're a divine group of people. And our reverend in Harare works very closely with Modric. And on most visits to Harare, I go pop in, we have a cup of coffee and we just chat, share ideas. Yeah, no, great. He's just the right guy for them. When were you last in Zimbabwe? 15 years ago?
No. That was when I met him. Okay. I used to have a project which we suspended because of various reasons. I don't know if you heard of Mapakumeri.
No.
Okay, Mapakumeri was really sort of a Lemba center, one of their villages, where a lot of the association started. A lot of the elders were very involved in trying to sort of rejoin mainstream Judaism. And so 15 years ago, I started my journey with them, and I went to Mapakumeri and I met the headman and the elders and started a project. We were supporting their schools and various things. So through that project, I met Modric. Do you know Jack Zeller?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so through Jack, I met Modric and Sandy Leader, and you know, so I still have a long, you know, association with them. We just a couple of years ago, I sent over Sidurim. The currency duels, the new ones that they have, I sent it to them.
Ah, bless you, fantastic.
Okay, so
yeah.
Anyway, I don't change
in South Africa, the issue is where do you live, by the way? Where do you live?
In Connecticut.
Okay. In South Africa, we have another problem with the Lemba in as you said, in Limpopo, etc., is that there's more than a triple in numbers of them than there are of us left today. And the reality is that over the years, they were dealt with in a very hostile manner, which wasn't appropriate, but that's not was out of my domain. But today, the problem is if they go to government and they get accredited as true Jews, then the few of us are wiped out. Then, you know, it becomes a huge problem. So at this stage, we've been able to keep them and work with them at a distance. But it's a brewing problem. It's definitely, there's no question about it. Talking about the Lemba, etc., we are involved now in a very interesting project in Uganda, which is one of our African countries. We're responsible for Jewish communities in 9 African countries. Is that there was a lady, Janice Masur, who lived there in the 1950s, and a number of her family members were buried in a Jewish cemetery in Uganda. And then she left with her parents in the early 1960s. She's actually written a book called Shalom Uganda. She lives in Canada, which is a most magnificent, incredible compilation of her family history. It's just phenomenal. And she wants to now find the graves of her family and the